The ice cracked like thunder beneath his boots, echoing through the skeletal remains of a once thriving mining outpost, now half buried in the snowdrift. Captain Vrex of the Zarn Dominion paused mid-stride, claws tensing beneath the armored gauntlets of his command suit. The sensors in his visor flickered, distorted by static, corrupted by the planet's dense electromagnetic interference. He couldn't trust the data. Not here. Not on this frozen, godforsaken world the humans called Arden's spine. Wind howled through the broken structures like a mourning spirit, dragging flakes of snow and ash through rusted support beams and twisted antennae. The sky overhead was a swirling bruise of storm clouds and ionized particles. Winter on this planet wasn't just a season. It was a siege. The temperature had dropped below 1700 Fahrenheit in the last cycle, and every breath Vrex took inside his filtration mask tasted like frostbite and rot. They'd landed here expecting minimal resistance. The Dominions? Scans had shown no significant cities, no large power signatures, no orbital defenses. Just a scattering of minor settlements, ancient infrastructure, and what looked like a dormant civilization eking out survival against planetary odds. It had been designated as a low-risk recon mission. Observe, document, and if needed, subjugate. What they hadn't seen were the traps, the bodies, the way shadows moved even when there was no light. Of the original 24 soldiers under his command, only 3 remained now. The others, elite, trained across 17 systems in urban and planetary warfare, had vanished. Some were dragged off screaming in the night. Others disappeared without a sound, leaving only frozen footprints. That ended abruptly, as if they'd simply evaporated. Something was wrong with this world. Not in a metaphysical way, no. In a tactical, bone-deep way. They'd been misled. Or worse, lured. Vrex scanned the perimeter again, eyes twitching between readouts. But the HUD was practically useless. Jamming fields coated the area like a net. He'd lost contact with orbit 12 hours ago. Last transmission received was a distorted audio file, garbled and broken. They don't sleep. Run. He didn't understand it then. He understood now, because they weren't alone here. Something stalked them. Not animals, not AI. Something human. But not the kind you'd meet in Accord embassies or Terran trade halls. These weren't diplomats or starship engineers. These weren't the species the Galactic textbooks described. As barely post-industrial, these were hunters, survivors. Cold-blooded in spirit if not in biology, and they didn't hibernate like other mammals. No, winter was when they thrived. "Captain!" The voice came over the comms. Private Drax, panicked. "Movement in Sector 9, fast! No heat signature!" Vrex turned sharply, raising his plasma carbine, but the snow swallowed all sound and light. Visibility was near zero. A blip flared briefly on his HUD, then vanished. He keyed his mic. "Fall back to Rendezvous Point Delta. Regroup, now." But no reply came, only static. Before we jump into this epic tale, subscribe to StarBound's HFY for the most intense sci-fi battles, legendary warriors, and universe-shaking wars. "Don't miss out! Hit that subscribe button and join the fight!" He began moving, boots crunching through crusted snow as he passed the smoldering wreckage of what had once been a Dominion recon crawler. Its hull was blackened, half melted by thermal charges. Not Dominion weapons, not even advanced, improvised, human-made. A shiver went through Vrex, not from the cold, but from a sudden, primal understanding. These humans didn't just fight, they adapted, they learned. Another crunch behind him. He spun, too slow. Something slammed into him from the side, a blur of bone and fur, and the world turned white as they crashed into the snowbank. His carbine flew from his hands, vanishing, into the storm. He wrestled with the attacker, muscles straining against their unnatural strength. This wasn't brute force. It was precision, control, trained hands. The blade they held wasn't powered or made of exotic alloys. It was forged steel, primitive, but efficient, scraping against the plating of his throat guard with a sound that made his skin crawl. And then, the attacker stopped. A face hovered inches from his. Human, but different. Icy eyes, calm and unreadable. skin pale and scarred, breath slow, not labored, despite the impossible cold. Their voice came low, guttural, carried more by intention than volume. You shouldn't have come in winter. Then, gone. Just like that. The wind swallowed them, and the snow was undisturbed where they'd stood. It was as if the storm itself had birthed them and taken them back. Vrex staggered up, clutching at the shallow cut across his neck, just enough to bleed. A message, a warning. This wasn't a slaughter, it was a hunt. From his comms came a new sound. A broken transmission, Squadron 12 to command, requesting emergency evac, resistance from locals, non-standard tactics, silent movement, no patterns, terrain manipulation, booby traps, requesting a scream, a crack, silence, in orbit, hidden behind the veil of charged atmospheric storms. The Dominion warship Zegrath's Will scanned the planet's surface once more. No signs of cities, no organized resistance, but clusters of moving heat blips in the northern wastes, fast, erratic, untraceable. Sub-Commander Rull frowned. Scanners still show no structured life. Are the drones malfunctioning? An older officer leaned over the console, his voice barely above a whisper. No, they're just not where we expect them to be. What do you mean? I mean they're not defending cities or hiding in caves. They're hunting, spreading out, encircling us. Back on the ground, Vrex limped through the white haze, activating a location beacon. He knew it was futile. No signal would reach the upper atmosphere through this storm. But protocol demanded it, and besides, he didn't want to die alone. The wind screamed louder now, almost like laughter. The blizzard was alive, and somewhere, just beyond the edge of sight, something moved. Not a beast, not a drone. A human. Watching, waiting, and Vrex, seasoned warrior of the Zarn Dominion, finally understood what terror truly felt like. This was their winter, and he was prey. The night stretched on like an eternity of frozen silence. The snow, endless and unyielding, fell in soft sheets, blurring the horizon until the world seemed to collapse into an unbroken void. The howling wind seemed to be mocking Vrex now, as if the planet itself was laughing at him. It was the first time he'd felt completely alone. The Dominion had never taught him this kind of isolation. Out here, there was no communication, no command hierarchy. There was only the crushing cold and the unseen force waiting in the dark. Vrex's breathing was ragged, fogging his visor with each exhalation. The cut across his throat had begun to sting, but it was the least of his worries. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but his mind refused to let him stop moving. He had no choice but to keep pushing forward, to make it to the rendezvous point, where, if he was lucky, he might find some sign of life. But deep down, he knew the truth. The rendezvous point was just a place on a map, and the map had betrayed him. There were no reinforcements coming. The storm was thickening again, the wind picking up speed, swirling the snow around him until he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. His footsteps left a faint trail in the snow. But the deeper he went into the blizzard, the more the storm seemed to erase them, as though the planet itself was hiding his presence. And that, Vrex realized, was the terrifying part. Because whatever hunted them here wasn't just taking lives, it was erasing them, blurring the line between predator and prey. No one would know they had ever existed. No one would ever know they had come. Vrex gritted his teeth and adjusted his grip on his rifle. The plasma carbine was a beast of a weapon, designed to cut through the toughest armor. But even it felt like a useless relic here. The human who had attacked him had been armed with nothing more than a blade. Yet it was the most dangerous weapon Vrex had encountered in his long career. For a moment, he allowed himself to think back to the moment of the attack. The feeling of being overpowered by something so simple. The human had moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible in these conditions. No energy readings, no heat signatures, no sound. It was as if the wind itself had come alive, taking on human form, stalking him with deliberate, lethal intent. He had underestimated them. And now, the cost of that underestimation was sinking in. He wasn't just on the run. He wasn't just a commander fighting for survival. He was a specimen, a subject in a study by a species that had long since abandoned anything resembling civilization as the Dominion understood it. These humans, with their primitive weapons and feral instincts, had adapted in a way that no other species could. They had become something else entirely. The thought sent a chill down his spine, colder than the biting wind. What kind of people survived on a planet like this, a world so inhospitable, so ruthless, that the very environment seemed intent on killing every living thing it touched? A place where every moment of survival was a triumph over the elements themselves? Vrex had seen worlds ravaged by war, planets reduced to ashes in the blink of an eye by the Dominion's most advanced weaponry. But this was something different. The humans had learned how to survive not just by adapting to their environment, but by becoming one with it. They had embraced the savage side of nature, becoming something darker, something almost mythological, and Vrex realized with sudden clarity. These were not the kind of creatures you could conquer. These were the kind of creatures who hunted until there was nothing left to hunt. The thought was maddening, almost suffocating. Vrex reached the wreckage of another structure, this one smaller, its walls crumpled inward like the bones of a giant. The stench of burnt electronics filled the air, a stark reminder that the humans had long since learned how to use Dominion technology against them. But this was no ordinary trap. It was a statement, a challenge. They had been watching, waiting. The wreckage had been arranged, strategically, deliberately, like an altar or a memorial. Whoever had died here had been given no burial, no rest. Their remains had been discarded, used as bait for the next unwitting victim. Suddenly, his comms crackled to life. "Captain Vrex, do you copy?" It was Drax. Faint, distant. "Drax?" Vrex whispered into his mic, his voice low, as if speaking too loudly might alert whatever was lurking in the snow. "Yes, Captain." "Barely." The voice was weak, strained. "I've found something, some sort of shelter. It's not Dominion-made. It's different." "I'm not alone, Captain." Vrex's pulse quickened. "Drax, do not engage. Do you hear me? Stay. Hidden. Stay." But the comms cut out with a burst of static. His heart pounded in his chest. The storm was too fierce. The interference was worse than ever. The planet wasn't just hiding them. It was tearing apart their connection to reality. It was making them believe they were isolated, lost, when in fact, they were already surrounded. Vrex tightened his grip on the carbine and pushed forward, every nerve alert, every instinct screaming that he wasn't alone. But where? Where could they be? The storm was too thick, the cold too biting. But in the deepest part of his mind, Vrex felt a cold, hard truth settle in. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was a test, a hunt, a game. And the humans who had made this world their home were the ones calling the shots. They had mastered the art of war on a level that even the Dominion couldn't comprehend. It wasn't about technology or advanced weaponry. It was about presence, the ability to move in the shadows, to strike without leaving a trace, to make their enemies doubt their very senses. Vrex had fought wars across countless star systems, against enemies far more advanced than these humans. He had faced horrors beyond imagination. But here, on this frozen world, surrounded by a storm that seemed to be alive, he realized something. The true strength of the humans wasn't in their weapons, their technology, or even their survival skills. It was in their will to endure. And that, Vrex understood, made them more dangerous than any enemy he had ever faced. In that moment, the storm seemed to close in around him, the wind picking up in a frenzy, as if the planet itself were inhaling, preparing for the final act. Somewhere out there, beneath the storm, something was moving. Something human. Something alive. And Vrex knew, whatever was waiting for him, it wouldn't stop until the hunt was over. Vrex's pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out the whistling wind and the distant creaking of snow beneath his boots. The storm had shifted again, the snow now falling in a flurry of sharp, icy stabs that cut through his armor. His vision was blurred by the condensation on his visor, but he could still see the shadows shifting through the snow. At first, it was just a flicker, a movement that caught the corner of his eye. Then it was gone. The hunters were out there. He could feel them, like ghosts, trailing just beyond his reach. They were everywhere and nowhere. For the first time, he didn't feel like the predator. He was the prey. He'd underestimated them. He had thought the humans were nothing more than an obstacle, primitive, weak, no match for the power of the Dominion. Now he knew the truth. They weren't just surviving. They were thriving in ways that defied logic. And whatever technology they lacked, they more than made up for with their ability to adapt, to blend in with the harshest of environments, to turn every disadvantage into a weapon. The feeling of being watched intensified, sending a shiver down his spine. It was more than just paranoia now. He couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on him, unseen, unblinking. He had heard stories of human tactics, guerrilla warfare they called it, the ability to melt into the environment, to fight in ways that made the enemy's superior technology irrelevant. But those were just stories, myths, born from the blood and fear of those who had lived to tell them. Vrex had never believed them. He had always assumed that the stories were exaggerated, the claims about human resilience just that. Claims. He was beginning to understand how wrong he had been. The first time he had encountered a human on this planet, he had underestimated them completely. He had expected a weak, desperate creature, a survivor clinging to the remnants of their once great empire. But what he had found was a predator. Silent, fast, relentless. It had moved like a shadow, appearing out of nowhere, striking with deadly precision, and then vanishing without a trace. There had been no dramatic battle, no grand confrontation, just a deadly, efficient strike that left him gasping for breath in the freezing cold, his throat torn open by a single swipe of a blade. The weapon was a simple thing, no more advanced than the hunting knives Vrex had seen in the primitive backwaters of other worlds, but it was deadly in the hands of its wielder. The human had been everything Vrex hadn't expected. He had been feral, wild, as if the storm itself had given him life. The blood was still fresh on Vrex's throat, a constant reminder of his failure. Vrex's hands tightened around his rifle, his knuckles white beneath his gloves. He had to push forward. His only hope now was to reach the shelter that Drax had found. If he could just get to him, just reunite with what was left of his team, they could fight back. They could make it through this. But the cold was relentless, a constant force pressing in from all sides, wearing him down bit by bit. His armor, once a marvel of Dominion engineering, was becoming a weight that dragged him down with every step. The freezing air bit through the seams, each breath a painful reminder that survival here was a matter of endurance, of willpower. And right now his will was beginning to fracture. He moved forward, step by step, the landscape a blur of whiteness, his vision narrowing as the cold gnawed at his bones. But the more he walked, the more he felt like he was walking in circles. The wreckage of their ships and base appearing over and over again, as if the planet was toying with him, refusing to give him an escape. His mind began to fray at the edges, his thoughts coming slower, more sluggish. And then, just as the last thread of his focus was about to snap, a shape emerged from the snow. At first, he thought it was a mirage, just another trick of the storm. But as he squinted through the snow, he saw it clearly. A figure, a human figure. It was small, hunched over, moving with the kind of predatory grace that made Vrex's heart stop in his chest. The figure didn't seem to notice him at first, moving in the shadows like a ghost, as if the storm itself had swallowed it whole. Vrex instinctively pressed himself against a rock, holding his breath as the figure moved closer, the snow crunching underfoot in a rhythmic pattern. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The human tilted its head slightly, as if listening for something. Vrex could see its breath, a faint mist rising into the air. The figure was looking straight at him. It had found him. Somehow, it had found him. Vrex's hand moved to the trigger, but his body hesitated. He couldn't just fire. He needed information. He needed to understand what was happening. This was not an ordinary soldier. This was something else. This was something other. The human spoke. Its voice barely audible over the wind, but Vrex heard it clearly. as though the words had been meant for him alone. "You're lost," it said. Vrex's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't see the human's face, clearly, but the voice, there was something almost comforting about it. A strange, unsettling calm in the midst of the storm. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't an order. It was a statement of fact, as if the human knew something he didn't. "You think you're still the predator," the human continued, stepping closer. "But out here, you're nothing." The words sliced through Vrex like a blade. He had spent his entire life training to be the predator, the hunter. He had never been the prey. Never. The human took another step forward, its movements fluid and deliberate. Vrex could feel his body tense, his instincts screaming at him to strike first, to survive. But something stopped him. Something in the way the human moved, something in the calmness of its gaze. "I don't need to hunt you," the human said, its tone almost pitying. "You're already dead." Vrex's heart raced. The words were a death sentence, the final blow in a fight he hadn't even known he was losing. He had come here to kill, to conquer. But now he realized that he was fighting something far beyond what his dominion had prepared him for. And in that moment, Vrex understood. It wasn't the planet that was hunting him. It was the humans. The ones who had learned how to survive anything, to endure the impossible. He wasn't just facing a battle for his life. He was facing something much more terrifying. The wrath of a species who had learned to survive in the most brutal way imaginable. A species who had embraced the storm, who had turned it into a weapon. He wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to prove that he could outlast the impossible. And as the human took another step closer, Vrex realized the truth. There was no escape. Not anymore. Vrex's body was on fire with adrenaline, his instincts screaming at him to act. But as the human closed the gap, the words reverberated in his mind like a haunting echo. "You're already dead." A phrase so simple, so cutting, it had stolen all his momentum. He couldn't move. His mind was locked in a moment of raw realization. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something deeper, something buried deep within his core. Pride. His fingers twitched on the rifle, but the fear wasn't the kind he had been trained to combat. This was something else. This was doubt. Doubt in everything he had ever believed about the Dominion's might, about his own prowess as a warrior. The human before him wasn't afraid. There was no hesitation, no sign of weakness. Just a calm, almost effortless presence that spoke volumes about the creature's certainty in its place in the universe. And that was terrifying. Vrex's breathing grew heavier, and he took a step back, just one, as his mind scrambled for a plan. But the human was already there, standing in front of him with a chilling serenity, as if it had anticipated this moment long before he had. And maybe it had. Maybe the human had known all along that the end was coming. Not just for Vrex, but for the entire Dominion. "Do you know what it's like to face an enemy who never stops?" the human said, its voice low, but carrying a weight that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "To fight a war where there's no winter, no off-season, there's no hiding, no rest. It's just hunting, constantly." Vrex's vision blurred as the cold started to gnaw through the seams of his armor, his thoughts growing sluggish. The storm had closed in around them now, a swirling vortex of white that erased everything beyond a few feet of visibility. The human's figure remained stark against the snow, its breath visible in the frigid air. But Vrex wasn't looking at the human anymore. He was looking at the landscape, the way the storm raged on, relentless, unforgiving, and it hit him. This wasn't just a battle for life and death. This was a fight for existence itself. The Dominion had fallen into a trap, thinking that they could conquer humanity through brute force, through overwhelming technology and resources. But the humans, they didn't need superior numbers or advanced weaponry. They had something far more dangerous: resilience, the will to survive, the primal instinct to endure, to keep fighting, no matter the cost. The Dominion's greatest strength had always been its ability to outlast enemies through sheer technological superiority. But that strategy was meaningless against a foe who didn't need technology to survive. who had lived through countless hardships, each one making them stronger, who had learned to thrive in environments that would destroy any other species. The human before him was a living embodiment of that resilience, standing in the heart of the storm with the same unwavering resolve that had carried humanity through its darkest moments. The Dominion had underestimated the human capacity for survival. They had believed they were the apex predators, the ones who could outthink and outlast all others. But now, Vrex saw it. The true horror of what he faced. "We don't need to rest," the human continued, its voice colder than the wind. "We don't need to wait for the seasons to turn. We hunt. All year. Every day. No breaks." Vrex's mind raced. He remembered the stories from his commanders, the ones who had dismissed the idea of a truly unstoppable human force. "They fight for survival, yes," they'd said, "but they have their limits. No species can endure forever." Yet here he stood, face to face with that very limit. An enemy that didn't have to fight fair. An enemy that didn't need to follow the rules of warfare. The human's words were like ice cutting through his thoughts. "We don't hide from the winter. We make it our ally." The human's lips curled in what might have been a smile, but it was the kind of smile that made Vrex feel like prey in a cage. It wasn't a victory grin. It was a warning. Vrex's hand finally moved, slowly reaching for his rifle. His fingers wrapped around the cold metal, but just as he raised it, the human moved. Faster than he could process, the figure was beside him, a blur of motion in the whiteout storm. The sound of a sharp snap echoed through the cold. Bone, not metal. The rifle was wrenched from his hand before he could even react, thrown into the snow like an insignificant toy. And then, the human was back in front of him, its eyes cold as it stared into his. The human wasn't even breathing heavily. There was no exhaustion, no sign of strain, just a perfect calm focus that spoke of a warrior who had been through 1,000 trials and had come out victorious every time. "You're out of your depth," the human whispered. "This world isn't one you can conquer, Dominion. It's one you survive in, or you die." Vrex's heart pounded, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. He hadn't expected this. Not this. He had been ready for the fight, for the challenge. But this was something else. The human was teaching him a lesson in survival, in endurance, in the unyielding will to live. Something that Vrex had never truly understood. He had never needed to. He thought of Drax, of the rest of his squad. They were out there, somewhere in the storm, fighting for their lives. But Vrex realized with a bitter, bitter certainty that they had already lost. The storm had already claimed them, and in a way, it had already claimed him too. The human gave a final, almost pitying look before turning to vanish into the swirling blizzard. Vrex stood frozen, his mind a whirl of thoughts, the bitter truth settling in. He had come here with arrogance, with the belief that he was the hunter, but in this moment, he was nothing more than a prey animal, lost in a storm that had no end. The storm roared louder, a reminder of the lesson that was now etched into Vrex's very soul. There was no escaping the human's world. Not unless you understood the true meaning of survival. The storm had not relented. Vrex stood at the edge of the battlefield, his armor battered, his body aching, but it was the wound to his spirit that weighed most heavily on him. The fierce winds, biting at his skin through the cracks in his suit, felt like the final judgment of a force far beyond his understanding. The Dominion had always prided itself on its superior technology, its iron-fisted control of countless systems. Yet here, in the heart of this cold, relentless world, they were nothing. Vrex's mind flickered back to the human's words. Words that had cut deeper than any weapon. "We don't hide from the winter. We make it our ally." The concept had been a riddle, a paradox he couldn't unravel. The Dominion had never needed to survive through the harshness of nature, not in the way humans did. They fought wars with technology, with ships, with engines that could vaporize entire planets. To the Dominion, survival was a matter of strategy, of overwhelming strength, not of enduring the unrelenting force of nature itself. But the human before him had shown him the truth. They had been living through the winters of their existence for centuries. and it had shaped them into something far more formidable than the Dominion had ever realized. The battle, once so full of promise for his forces, was now a fading memory. The sounds of war, the screaming of dying soldiers, the sharp cracks of explosions, the reverberating hum of alien technology, had all but ceased. What remained was the hollow silence of a world that had been stripped bare, the snow falling like ash over a lost war. Vrex's squad, what remained of them, was scattered across the landscape, the remains of what could only be described as a massacre. The human was still out there, somewhere, perhaps waiting. Vrex didn't know. The wind and snow obscured everything, turning the battlefield into a white void. The cold seeped through his armor now, numbing him more than any weapon could. In a way, it was fitting. He had underestimated the human, and now the human was showing him the full weight of that mistake. He was no longer in control, no longer the predator he had once been. His comlink buzzed with static, barely audible through the storm. He forced himself to listen, the voice coming through faint but clear. "Vrex, this is Drax. We're pulling back. The rest of the squads—" Drax's voice faltered, and Vrex could hear the strain, the disbelief in his words. "This isn't a war we can win. The humans, they don't fight the same way. They don't fight for victory. They fight to survive, and that makes them unstoppable." Vrex gripped his helmet, staring at the desolate horizon. The truth of it all washed over him in waves. The Dominion had been blind. They had entered this world thinking it would be just another conquest, just another star system to add to their vast empire. They had thought they could crush humanity like they had crushed so many others, overwhelm them with sheer power, with their unrelenting advance. But the humans had never been about winning. They were about endurance, about surviving when all hope seemed lost. They fought for the long haul, for the centuries that stretched beyond the horizon, and they had learned how to make even the harshest of environments their ally. The human race didn't wait for things to get better. They fought through the winters, through the ice and the storms. They adapted, and in adapting, they became more than any invader could ever understand. The Dominion had underestimated their enemy again and again, and now they were paying the price. Vrex's thoughts swirled, and a deep, existential dread began to sink in. What did survival even mean for a species that had never known true vulnerability? The Dominion had never been tested like this, had never faced an enemy that didn't bend under the weight of technology, an enemy that didn't break under the endless pressure of war. They had relied on their power, on their fleets, on their unassailable might, but none of it had mattered in the face of humanity's primal drive. He stood in the middle of the ruined battlefield, staring at the bleak horizon. The human presence, almost mythical now, had left its mark on him in a way that would never be erased. It wasn't just the threat of death that haunted him. It was the recognition of something far more insidious. A species that didn't just survive, but thrived on the edge of destruction. A species that, despite all odds, continued to rise, to push forward. Vrex realized for the first time the terrifying beauty of humanity's nature. It wasn't their weapons that made them dangerous. It wasn't their ships or their technology. It was their refusal to stop. The storm might have raged on, but humanity had already embraced it. They had lived through far worse than this. Their legacy wasn't one of fleeting victory. It was one of unrelenting perseverance. And in that moment, as the wind howled and the world seemed to close in on him, Vrex understood the true cost of this war. The Dominion wasn't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting the very essence of what made humans human, their ability to endure, to never stop hunting, even when it seemed like there was nothing left to fight for. It was a war they could never win. As Vrex activated his comlink to transmit the order to retreat, he glanced one last time at the humans' footprints in the snow, already being swallowed by the storm. It had won. But that victory wasn't something the Dominion could ever understand. The battle might be over, but the true war was far from finished. And humanity? They were just getting started. Thank you for your patience. If you enjoyed the narrative, feel free to like, share, and comment with your thoughts below.